Annie, this is Torin, and we're turning a lifeboat into a liveaboard. Most of this episode is about exterior work, but if you know me, you know I'm a little bit impatient, to say the least. And so I really wanted to get a sense of what Luya was going to look like in a couple of years when she's all done. So you can see I took out my trusty Sharpie and started marking out where the walls would be, the table and benches, and the end of our sleeping area. What you can't see is the rest of the boat, but believe me, I tried that too. On the other hand, Torin's been blessed with a lot more patience than me, so he just wanted to get going on the real work. Here he is getting ready to grind out the hull.
All the little holes that we made in the boat need to be ground out so that we can re-fiberglass them all. But I prefer to be as less itchy as possible.
Meanwhile, I turned the car into a mobile office and hid in there doing some design work. And then Torin, being a hero, started to grind. If you've ever done this, you'll know, but this is hot, hard, sweaty, boring work. It's also pretty critical. If you don't grind out the fiberglass properly, you risk the new fiberglass not bonding, and in your hull, especially the parts underwater, that would be kind of disastrous. And if you're worried about how this was all going to go because you saw our last disastrous video, rest assured, we did much better this time. As you can see, between the various attachment points, through hulls, and safety devices we no longer needed, there were no shortage of holes for Torin to grind out. After giving everything a wipe to remove any dust or residue, we were ready to start fiberglassing. Unfortunately, I filmed this little bit on my phone, but you can see all of the pieces of fiberglass we've pre-cut in preparation to layering in the holes. Here, Torin's saturating each small piece of glass with epoxy in order to put it onto the boat. If you saw our last episode, you'll know that we had a pretty unfortunate run-in with polyester resin, and so since then, we've switched to West Systems epoxy, which is so much easier to use. We were always going to use that for anything under the waterline anyway, but now we're using it everywhere. After sandwiching a couple of pieces of the saturated fiberglass together, it's time to attach it to the hull. This is also done by kind of using the epoxy as a sandwich filling to glue it all together. And as you can see, when you saturate the fiberglass, it goes from being opaque white to quite translucent. After all is said and done, and after many hours of methodically moving around the hull, we ended up with these solid but kind of gnarly looking patches. So once again, it was time to sand and then time to fair. Fairing fiberglass basically means making it smooth. And to do that, we use something called fairing compound, which is basically like a putty. As you can see, you use a putty knife to smooth out the hull and actually make the surface a little bit proud or higher than the rest of the hull. That way, when it's dry, you can come through with a sander and bring it down to the level of the main hull. You may have to do this a few times, and we did, but eventually you should end up with a pretty smooth surface where you can't even tell where the fiberglass has been repaired. For us, we're aiming for a 10-foot hull. It's a bit of a joke, but basically it means that from 10 feet away your hull looks perfect, and from any closer you start to see those imperfections. We're pretty happy with how it worked out, and places like this, they're under the waterline, and I don't think the fish care too much what it looks like. Holes filled, we moved on to a project that was a bit more fun, the Freck. If you're wondering what a Freck is, it's our funny name for our front deck. These lifeboats have a ton of interior space for their size, but they're very short on exterior space. So along with a walkway, which you'll see in future episodes, we also decided to put a small love seat cut into the foredeck and roughly replacing where that open hatch is. So we're building the seat part of our front deck, which will be 3 feet at the bow end and 5 feet towards the stern. So So we're just cutting out our big wedge of plywood that will have a little hanging frame to suspend it over our bed. After cutting the pieces, we had the very, very rough outline of our love seat. The first step in attaching it all together was to use a biscuit jointer. I never used one before, but these are pretty cool. What Torin's doing when he pushes it towards the wood is using the teeny tiny little circular saw that's part of the tool to kind of dig out a hollow in the wood. That will be matched by the football-shaped pieces of wood or biscuits, which help kind of glue everything together. Some careful marking and measuring is required to make sure that you put your holes in the correct place on each piece of wood so that one biscuit will align into 2 holes. But once we did that, we were ready for some wood and glue and to put the pieces together. And here we are doing just that. You can see that we've used wood glue to put the biscuits into one side of the wood, and then with more wood glue in the receiving piece of wood, we're going to squish it all together. This is a pretty cool way of attaching it because you can't really see how it's joined together. That said, we're about to screw it together for more strength, but for a moment you can appreciate the nearly seamless seam. With that roughly assembled, it was time to move on to the frame, which would hold the Freck in to the foredeck. It's a little hard to visualize, but hopefully you'll see as we go along. Here, Torin's cutting the 2x4 at an angle so that it better fits against the shape of our hull. Next, Torin marked the internal framework and drilled holes so that he would be able to bolt them in from the other side. Starting with a layer of Sikaflex, we attached it to the hull. Torin's using bolts, and it's kind of funny because Torin loves a bolt. I'm always teasing him that every time we go into a store, he just needs one more bolt. And this does predate Luya, to be fair, but ever since we got her, it has really gotten out of hand. Anyway, those bolts are coming in handy here because he's attaching what will eventually become the framework for our Freck. If there's one thing that's true about any boat project, even the ones you're doing from scratch, it's that spaces are small and sometimes it's just hard to see what you're doing. What you're looking at here will eventually be the outside of the boat. In fact, it'll be our little love seat. Here you can see the view from the bed, and yes, that is an absolute head smacker. I'm used to it now, but a day or two after we installed it, I walked right into that wall, and it hurt just as much as you imagine. And that's about it for what we did in May. Not as disastrous as our last episode, not as exciting either, but hopefully still interesting. Thank you so much for following along with our journey to build Luya. We so appreciate all of your comments and questions, and we think it's so cool that other people are as interested in her as we are. Those of you who found us on Patreon, we cannot thank you enough. It's so amazing to have your support this early, and we're just so grateful. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really does help the algorithm, or so we're told, but either way, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye!